In mid-1989, the Federal Reserve began a series of actions to try to save the U.S. banking system. The Fed began lowering interest rates. They would not rise again until 1994 to increase the bank's profits. It was not enough. During the first 4 months of 1990, Michael Milken's Drexel Burnham Lambert, the Campo Corporation, brokerage Thompson McKinnon, and Columbia Savings, with its $8 billion in junk bonds, all collapsed. By the summer, New York real estate developer Donald Trump joined the ranks of other Golden Boy developers like Houston's Gerald Hines and Atlanta's John Portman, who had defaulted on their loans. The Fed took dramatic action just before Thanksgiving Day, 1990, when it secretly took control of the bankrupt Citicorp, America's largest bank. A couple of weeks later, federal regulators held secret meetings to discuss how to handle the insolvency of Citicorp, Chase Manhattan, Chemical, Manufacturers Hanover, Security Pacific, and the Bank of New England. The regulators' decisions soon became obvious. The Bank of New England was closed in January 1991. A merger between Chemical and Manufacturers Hanover was announced in June 1991, as was a merger between NCNB and the ailing CNS Sovereign, forming an even more bankrupt Nations Bank. In August, Bank of America took over the ailing Security Pacific. In a little over a month, mergers involving 6 of the 12 largest banks in the country had been announced. Citicorp, being too big for anyone to swallow and too bankrupt to swallow, was put on a federal life support system, bailed out in large part by Saudi money as part of the price for the war against Iraq. Even while the feds were bailing out the banks, other parts of the financial system were collapsing. The banking systems of Norway and Sweden collapsed in late 1991 and 1992, resulting in government bailouts. In April 1992, Canadian real estate developer Olympia in York, the largest real estate developer in the world, was unable to pay its debts. Olympia in York filed for bankruptcy in June. A month later, a similar liquidity crisis hit the huge Edper Group of Canada's Edward and Peter Bronfman. In September 1992, the U.S. and British banks launched currency warfare against the European monetary system. With inside information from the Federal Reserve, Citicorp and speculator George Soros made about $2.5 billion, and other U.S. banks profited handsomely. The resultant collapse of the lira, however, caused huge derivatives losses for many Italian companies, many of them who had borrowed from U.S. banks, such as Bankers Trust. 1993 began with the bankruptcy of Bramley, a real estate developer owned by Edper. In July, the banks launched another round of currency attacks against the European monetary system, this time bankrupting the Bank of France. Trizec, another Edper real estate firm, teetered. Banesto, a big Spanish bank advised by J.P. Morgan, was put into receivership, and Germany's Metallgesellschaft announced huge derivatives losses. All during this period, the banks had been rapidly increasing their derivatives exposure, and the bubble which the Fed had created to save the banks was now in danger of disintegrating and taking the entire system down with it. Slide 3. This slide shows the effects of the bank's headlong rush into speculation. By September 1994, the U.S. banking system as a whole had some $4 trillion in assets and another $16 trillion in off-balance sheet derivatives. Now, this graph, the blue is the assets. The blue and the green is the loans. So up to the top of the blue line is what appears on the bank's balance sheets, what people think of when they think of how healthy their bank is. The red area on top of that is the off-balance sheet derivatives. Now, if you can barely make out at the bottom, there's a little black line there. It looks sort of like the the margin there is just a little wider than it should be. Now that's the equity of the U.S. banking system. That's what's supposedly standing between the bankruptcy of the banking system and the health of the bankruptcy system. Now, I think you can look at this and you can see that every statistic that you've ever seen put out by any bank or any government agency like the FDIC about the health of the banking system is absurd. It doesn't take much to collapse this kind of a process. Okay, next slide. All right. As of mid-1994, 6 banks, Citicorp, Chemical, Morgan, Bankers Trust, Chase, and Bank America, held more than $1 trillion in derivatives each. This is where most of the derivatives exposure of the U.S. banking system lies. Chemical Bank alone held derivatives of $3.1 trillion, a figure equivalent to 3/4 of the assets of the entire U.S. banking system. And backing that up is $170 billion in assets. The little blue smudges there, that's their assets. Now, I didn't bother to put equity on this because you would never even begin to see it. That's our banking system today. So to deal with this bubble, the Fed reversed its 5-year-long policy of cutting interest rates in February 1994. This change caught many of the speculators who had bet on continuing lowering of interest rates off guard and left them with massive losses. The big hedge funds lost billions of dollars, with rumors of the insolvency of banks like our friend Bankers Trust sweeping the market. The market for collateralized mortgage obligations, or CMOs, a form of mortgage derivative, dried up and took Kidder Peabody, the CMO leader, with it. The bond markets took huge losses. Bankers Trust got caught flagrantly cheating its customers. In December 1994, Orange County, California found itself with $2 billion in losses on its derivatives portfolio and was liquidated by its creditors on Wall Street. Spooked investors fled, causing runs at the Texas state-run Tex Pool and similar funds across the country. The crisis then spread across the border to Mexico, where it was temporarily calmed with a $50 billion international support package. In April 1994, Lyndon LaRouche issued his 9th economic forecast. The presently existing global financial and monetary system will disintegrate during the near term. The collapse might occur this spring or summer or next autumn. It could come next year. It will almost certainly occur during President William Clinton's first term in office. That collapse into disintegration is inevitable because it could not be stopped now by anything but the politically improbable decision by leading governments to put the relevant financial and monetary institutions into bankruptcy reorganization. The reason the system will disintegrate is that it depends upon its survival, on an income stream from the real economy, and that economy is collapsing. That is, the productive capacity of the economy, measured in goods produced per capita, per household, and per square kilometer, is shrinking. Next slide. This slide shows how the percentage of the labor force involved in manufacturing is declining. The long, steady growth of manufacturing, which enabled the United States to become the industrial engine of the world, peaked in 1920, when 27% of the labor force was involved in manufacturing. That percentage dropped with the Depression down to the red line. It climbed back up to 25% in 1950 and has declined ever since to the point where it is now below the level of the Great Depression and back to the level of the 1860s. Next slide. So this collapse can be seen as an example in U.S. steel production. This is steel, short tons of steel produced per capita. Since 1965, U.S. per capita steel production has fallen by 50%. Our steel producing capacity has fallen similarly, to the point where we neither have the capacity nor the labor force to produce the amount of steel we need to build our way out of the current crisis. Next slide, please. The U.S. economy is now operating below the break-even point. For every dollar of profit the economy produces, it incurs over $4 in debt. It's hard to get ahead that way. Next slide, please. So this slide shows graphically LaRouche's proof that attempts by the Federal Reserve and the government to save the bubble by pumping it up only made things worse. The greater the so-called profit from the bubble, the more money the real economy loses. Currently, for every dollar of so-called profit, we lose $2.50 and incur $4 in debt, for a total loss of $6.50 per dollar. That's like going down to the store and buying dollars for $7.50 a piece, and then taking the dollar that you buy and calling it profit. Furthermore, the guy we're borrowing the money from doesn't have any money either. He's stealing it from somebody else. And that somebody else is the rest of the world. We're stealing money from Ibero-America, from Africa, from Asia, from the former East Bloc countries. We're looting their populations and our own to keep the bubble alive. The solution to this crisis begins with recognizing the disease, the decay and inevitable disintegration of the existing central bank money system, LaRouche said recently. Nothing can be done and nothing should be done to save this system. You have to tell the patient to give up the diseased organ. Otherwise, the patient will die. What we have to do, very simply, LaRouche said, is to seize the U.S. federal Constitution and the work of Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, the work of Henry Carey, of Friedrich List, and Abraham Lincoln with both hands and say, this was good. Let us eliminate that which replaced it, which is now dying, and let us bring it back into operation. Thank you. Citicorp, being too big for anyone to swallow and too bankrupt to swallow, was put on a federal life support system, bailed out in large part by Saudi money as part of the price for the war against Iraq. Even while the feds were bailing out the banks, other parts of the financial system were collapsing. The banking systems of Norway and Sweden. In mid-1989, the Federal Reserve began a series of actions to try to save the U.S. banking system. The Fed began lowering interest rates. They would not rise again until 1994 to increase the bank's profits. It was not enough. During the first 4 months of 1990, Michael Milken's Drexel Burnham Lambert, the Campo Corporation, January 1991, a merger between Chemical and Manufacturers Hanover was announced in June 1991, as was a merger between NC&B and the ailing CNS Sovereign, forming an even more bankrupt Nations Bank. In August, Bank of America took over the ailing Security Pacific. In a little over a month, mergers involving 6 of the 12 largest banks in the country had been announced. Brokerage Thompson McKinnon and Columbia Savings, with its $8 billion in junk bonds, all collapsed. By the summer, New York real estate developer Donald Trump joined the ranks of other Golden Boy developers like Houston's Gerald Hines and Atlanta's John Portman, who had defaulted on their loans. The Fed took dramatic action just before Thanksgiving Day, 1990, when it secretly took control of the bankrupt Citicorp, America's largest bank. A couple of weeks later, federal regulators held secret meetings to discuss how to handle the insolvency of Citicorp, Chase Manhattan, Chemical, Manufacturers Hanover, Security Pacific, and the Bank of New England. The regulators' decisions soon became obvious. The Bank of New England was closed in January